name is Linda Walcott. I'm with the Division of Aging. I will be talking about Waiver 101. What is a waiver? The waiver actually came from the Social Security Act, which permits states to offer an array of services for people to avoid institutionalization. And the term waiver refers to waiving of certain federal requirements. For example, home and community-based services, or waivers, are not Medicaid entitlement programs. Now, states have flexibility in design, as you can see on this slide. They can determine the target group of beneficiaries. They can specify the services that are furnished. They can incorporate opportunities for participants to direct and manage their waiver services. They can also determine the qualifications of the providers, and they can design strategies to assure the health and welfare of waiver participants. They can also manage a waiver to promote the cost-effective delivery of services. They can link delivery of waiver services to other programs and other associated service delivery systems. And they can also develop and implement a quality improvement strategy. In order to launch a waiver, a state must submit an initial waiver application to CMS. CMS stands for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And as you can see here, the initial approval is for 3 years. We have 5-year renewal periods after that. It does require the submission of certain waiver reports, and each subsequent renewal also requires the submission of a renewal application and a CMS determination that the state has continued to meet federal requirements. If the state wants to change the waiver while it is in effect, it must submit an amendment. All requests for new waivers, waiver renewals, and amendments must be submitted to CMS by the state Medicaid agency. The state must specify the scope and nature of each service, and they must specify the qualifications of the individuals or the agencies that furnish each waiver service. An example of an amendment would be for an addition of an additional service, or maybe changing a service, maybe changing some of the parameters, some of the requirements. Now, there are some limitations. Except in limited circumstances, all costs of room and board are up to the waiver participants to provide. They can be provided also by other resources or other sources. And in the application, the state must specify the unduplicated number of individuals that the state intends to serve each year that the waiver is in effect. Cost neutrality. Basically, the waiver has to be lower cost than the same cost in a nursing home. For example, an individual that is on the waiver, their costs must be less than their costs if they were living in a nursing facility. And an example would be, if you would look for the case managers, if you would look at your cost comparison budget, you will see that this is displayed in the cost tab as that this particular cost is broken down per client. Now, nationally, there is only one state that does not operate a waiver, and that is Arizona. There is no limit to how many waivers a state can have. And as you can see on the slide, in 2006, each state operated an average of 6 waivers. The waiver must assure participant health and welfare. For one thing, the waiver has to specify the qualifications of the waiver providers and verify that they continually meet the qualifications. They have to periodically monitor the implementation of the service plan. They have to identify and respond to alleged instances of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. and they have to institute appropriate safeguards concerning practices that may cause harm to the participant or restrict participant rights. Participants must have a choice, not only of receiving services in an institution rather than in home and community-based service settings, but they have to have a choice of services and they have to have a choice of providers. Now, as you can see on this slide, this really talks about quality assurance and the waiver design, the policies, procedures, waiver requirements. There is a whole nother section that will be explained by the Quality Assurance Department. The Division of Aging currently operates 2 waivers, the Aged and Disabled Waiver and the Traumatic Brain Injury Waiver. Now, the provider responsibilities. Providers must understand the service definitions and the parameters. So when they get a notice of an action from a case manager or from the state, once the state approves the case manager's plan, they need to understand what the service definitions are and what exactly is allowed. The waiver providers are subject to audit and potential recoupment if those are not in agreement on the approved notice of action. And if the needs of a waiver participant change, the provider must contact the case manager to discuss revising the service plan. If a service can be funded under the state plan, it is the provider's responsibility to seek state plan prior authorization before the service is requested as a Medicaid waiver service. You will often hear the term that waiver is the payer of last resort, and this is kind of where this comes from. If a service can be delivered under the Medicaid state plan, it is expected that it will do so. We must have documentation of prior authorization denial, and that denial has to be an appropriate denial. It cannot just be because the provider failed to submit certain documentation that was needed to process that prior authorization. Now, one of the responsibilities of the provider, and this is found in Rule 455 IAC 284, that is our aging rule. The providers are required to furnish at least 30 days written notice before terminating waiver services to an individual. And as you see on the slide, these are the people that must be notified when they give written notice. Now, if you will look in that rule, you will see that there are some more specific requirements about that. I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to this slide. The rule also specifies that the provider must continue to provide services while another provider is located. There are some times, though, when it is unsafe for a provider to go into the home, and they can request that that 30 days written notice be waived. Okay, as you see here, the last 5-year renewal for the Aged and Disabled waiver was approved by CMS July 1st, 2013. It runs from July through June each year. And as you see, for the current year, Indiana is approved to serve 16,081 individuals through this waiver. So far, we have served just under 14,000 individuals. The eligibility requirements: an individual must be eligible for an appropriate aid category of Indiana Medicaid and must meet nursing facility level of care. The traumatic brain injury waiver, the last 5-year renewal, was effective January 1st, 2013. It does correspond to the calendar year. It runs January through December, and it is approved to serve 200 individuals each waiver year. The eligibility requirements: An individual does have to be eligible for an appropriate aid category of Indiana Medicaid. And for this waiver, they have to meet either of two institutional levels of care, either a nursing facility level of care or ICF-ID. That used to be ICF-MR. That actually stands for Immediate Care Facility for Intellectual Disability. The MR did refer to mentally retarded. And they must also have a diagnosis of traumatic brain injury. Please note that this is traumatic, not anoxic. Indiana defines a traumatic brain injury as a trauma that has occurred as a closed or open head injury by an external event. Examples of external agents are mechanical or events that result in interference with vital functions. It also means a sudden insult or damage to brain function. This is not of a degenerative or congenital nature. It may also produce an altered state of consciousness and may result in a decrease in cognitive, behavioral, emotional, or physical functioning, resulting in partial or total disability, not including birth trauma-related injury. Now, the next couple of slides show all of the services that are available on these two waivers, and you'll see behind each service it'll indicate A and D for aged and disabled, or TBI for traumatic brain injury. And you can see here that the traumatic brain injury waiver has several services that pertain more to the kinds of functioning that they would need. For example, behavior management, behavior programming, and counseling. That's only for the traumatic brain injury waiver. Another one is residential-based habilitation, supported employment. And then you'll also see that there are a couple services that are just for the aged and disabled waiver, such as structured family caregiving. And this last slide shows the resources where we got this information from.